You know, sometimes life throws you into such a dark corner that you almost start believing you don't matter, that your existence is just something people step on to make themselves feel taller. And that was exactly how I felt the night I sat inside my old beaten-down car with the rain hammering on the roof while I tried to count the coins I had left to see if I could buy a sandwich before heading to my night shift. I never thought in a million years that someone like me, who had dreams and hopes and an innocent heart, would end up using the back seat of a rusted car as a bedroom, folding my jacket into a pillow and covering myself with a blanket that smelled like old dust, just because the very people who were supposed to protect me, love me, and raise me decided I was nothing but a burden to them. My stepmother's sharp voice still echoed in my mind every night. Her words like blades, "You'll never amount to anything. You're just dead weight." My stepbrothers weren't any kinder. They laughed at me whenever I tried to stand up for myself, pushed me around, stole my things, and called me names that dug deep into my soul. The only way I kept myself sane was by working 2 jobs, sometimes back-to-back shifts. My eyes red from lack of sleep, but my heart stubbornly beating because I kept telling myself if I could just hold on a little longer, maybe there would be a way out. But no one knew the truth. To everyone around me at the diner where I worked during the day, I was just another tired employee with a forced smile. To the people at the warehouse where I worked overnight, I was just another body, clocking in and out. None of them knew that when the shift was over, I didn't go home. I went to the dark corner of the parking lot, sat in my car, locked the doors, and tried to find rest in the suffocating silence of loneliness. I didn't want anyone to know, not my coworkers, not my classmates from school who had already forgotten about me, and especially not my family, because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crawl back and beg. I told myself I was strong, that I could make it on my own, but no matter how many times I whispered those words, the truth was that the nights were cold, the mornings were harder, and my body was breaking piece by piece. And yet, something deep inside me kept me going, like a tiny light flickering in the darkest tunnel, telling me not to give up. What I didn't know was that somewhere far away, someone who shared my blood, someone I had almost forgotten about, was about to stumble upon the truth of my hidden life, and that discovery would change everything forever, pulling me out of the shadows I had been forced to live in, and throwing me into a world I had never imagined possible. The night it all started to change was one of the worst nights I had faced so far. The kind of night where everything inside you screams that you've hit rock bottom, but somehow, you're still forced to keep breathing and moving because there's no other choice. I remember I had just finished a double shift 12 hours at the diner, where I carried trays, smiled at rude customers, and ignored the aching in my legs, followed by another 8 hours at the warehouse, where the only sound was the constant hum of machines and the metallic clang of boxers being moved. By the time I finally clocked out, my body felt like it was made of lead, my eyelids heavy, my stomach growling from hunger I couldn't afford to satisfy. And the only thing I wanted was to collapse into the back seat of my car and shut out the world. But when I got to the parking lot that night, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. My uncle's car. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he stopped visiting after my dad's death, and I almost thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. He had always been the mysterious figure in my childhood, the one people whispered about at family gatherings, saying he had become wealthy, that he traveled the world, that he lived in a mansion far beyond the imagination of people like us. But to me, he was just the uncle who used to ruffle my hair when I was little, and tell me that one day I'd be stronger than anyone thought. I didn't even know why he was there in that city, in that lot, at that hour. But fate works in strange ways, and sometimes it places the right person in front of you when you least expect it. I panicked. My first instinct was to hide, to duck into my car before he saw me, because I didn't want him to know the truth. How could I explain to him that his niece, the girl he once knew, was now living in her car like a stray, with nowhere to go? But destiny had other plans, because just as I reached for the door handle, I heard his voice call my name. The sound of it broke me. It had been so long since anyone had said my name with warmth, with familiarity, with a touch of care that I didn't even realize tears were slipping down my cheeks before I could turn around. He looked at me with confusion at first, then shock, then something else I couldn't place, as his eyes moved from me to the shabby car behind me. His expression tightened, and without asking for permission, he walked closer, his gaze burning into me as though he was piecing together a puzzle that hurt him more with every detail he noticed. "Are you living here?" he asked, his voice low, careful, almost as if he was afraid of breaking me. And in that moment, all the walls I had built, all the stubborn pride I had held on to survive, collapsed. I couldn't speak, couldn't lie, couldn't hide anymore. I just nodded, and the shame that washed over me was unbearable. I expected him to judge me, to pity me, maybe even to turn away. But instead, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in anyone's eyes for a very long time. And that single look, that single second, became the spark that would ignite a fire of change in my life that I never saw coming. When he didn't walk away, when instead he reached out and placed a steady hand on my shoulder, I felt something inside me crack open, something that had been locked away for years while I fought to survive on my own. I had gotten so used to people turning their backs on me, so used to being treated like I was invisible or worthless, that the simple gesture of his hand on my shoulder nearly broke me into pieces. I tried to speak, tried to explain, but all that came out was a choked sob, and before I knew it, I was crying into the night air, my body shaking from the release of everything I had been holding back for so long. My uncle didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He let me cry, his hands still resting there, as if to remind me I wasn't alone anymore. And after what felt like forever, he spoke again, his voice firm but gentle, the kind of tone that demanded the truth but promised safety at the same time. "Tell me everything," he said, and somehow, even though I had sworn never to let anyone see my weakness, the words spilled out of me like floodwaters breaking through a dam. I told him about the stepmother who had turned my home into a prison, about the stepbrothers who mocked and hurt me, about the endless nights when I prayed my father would come back and rescue me, only to wake up to the crushing reality that he was gone and I was trapped. I told him how I had worked myself to the bone just to escape, how I had saved up enough to buy the car that now doubled as my shelter, and how I juggled 2 jobs because the thought of returning to that house was unbearable. My voice cracked as I admitted how I sometimes went to bed hungry, how I hid in the shadows so no one would know, how I felt invisible and yet exposed every single day. My uncle listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving mine, his expression shifting from shock to anger to sorrow as he pieced together the cruelty I had endured. By the time I finished, I was drained, hollow, staring at the ground because I couldn't bear to see the pity I was sure would be in his eyes. But when he finally spoke, his words were not what I expected. "You should have told me sooner," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "because you are not alone in this world, not while I'm still here." That was when the wall between us dissolved completely, and for the first time in years, I felt like family wasn't just a word used by people to chain me down. It was a promise, a bond, something that could actually protect me instead of destroy me. My uncle insisted we leave the lot right then, that I shouldn't spend another night in that car. And even though my pride whispered that I didn't want charity, my heart knew this was different. This wasn't charity. This was someone who cared, someone who wanted me safe, someone who remembered the little girl I used to be and refused to let her fade away. So I got into his car, my belongings stuffed in a trash bag, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the vehicle that had been my prison and my shelter all at once, knowing that part of my life was ending but unsure what awaited me ahead. Little did I know that this drive was the first step into a world of warmth, wealth, and healing that I had never dared to imagine. And though it terrified me, it also lit a small flame of hope I thought had died long ago. The drive to his home felt like stepping into another reality, one that my weary mind could hardly comprehend. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching the trash bag that held my entire life, some worn clothes, a few notebooks filled with half-written dreams, and a picture of my father that I had guarded like treasure. The city lights blurred past the window as I tried to make sense of what was happening, my emotions a storm of gratitude, disbelief, and fear. My uncle didn't push me to talk. He simply drove with a calmness that made me feel, for the first time in years, that I was safe. But the silence wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken promises, like the kind of silence you only share with someone who sees you, truly sees you. When we finally turned into a long, winding driveway that seemed to stretch forever, my breath caught in my throat. The house that stood at the end wasn't just a house, it was a mansion. A towering structure of glass and stone, glowing warmly against the night sky. I had never seen anything like it except in movies, and the sight of it made me shrink a little in my seat, wondering if I belonged there at all. I glanced at him nervously, but he gave me a reassuring smile, as if he already knew what I was thinking. "This is your home now," he said softly, and those words lodged themselves deep in my heart. A seed of hope I was afraid to water because I didn't want to believe it, only to have it ripped away. When we stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and fresh flowers, a scent that made me realize just how long it had been since I had lived anywhere that felt alive. The floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, and the furniture looked like it belonged in magazines. But what struck me most wasn't the wealth, it was the warmth. Somehow, despite its size, the house didn't feel cold or distant. There were family photos on the walls, little reminders of a life built with love and care, and I felt a pang of longing in my chest, wondering if I would ever feel like I fit in such a place. My uncle led me through the halls, showing me a bedroom that was bigger than the entire living room of the house I had once lived in, with a bed so soft it looked like a cloud. I stood frozen at the door, my hands trembling as I clutched my bag tighter, unable to take a step inside. "Go on," he encouraged. "It's yours." I didn't know how to explain the flood of emotions crashing over me, the disbelief that this space could belong to me, the fear that it was temporary, the aching hope that maybe, just maybe, life was giving me a second chance. Slowly, I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. The moment my weight sank into the mattress, a sob broke out of me, uncontrollable and raw, because it had been so long since I had felt anything close to comfort. My uncle knelt beside me, his eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "You don't ever have to go back there," he said, his voice steady and certain. "You are safe here." And for the first time in years, I believed it. That night, I lay under warm blankets, staring at the ceiling, too overwhelmed to sleep. My body was finally at rest, but my mind raced with doubts. Could I really stay? Did I deserve this? What if my stepmother found out and tried to pull me back? The fear still lingered, like chains clamped around my ankles, but beneath it, something new was taking root, of fragile but persistent hope that maybe my story wasn't over, that maybe this was the beginning of something greater. I thought of my father then, of the way he used to tell me that storms don't last forever. And for the first time since losing him, I felt like his words might actually be true. My uncle had found me, rescued me from the shadows, and even though I couldn't see the road ahead, I knew it was brighter than anything I had left behind. The days that followed felt like walking into a dream I was afraid to wake up from. At first, I didn't know how to exist in this new world, how to carry myself inside walls that didn't echo with cruelty or halls that weren't filled with judgment. I moved carefully, like a guest in a stranger's house, tiptoeing around as though I might be sent away if I touched the wrong thing or overstayed my welcome. My uncle seemed to sense my unease, and instead of overwhelming me with questions or plans, he gave me time, space, and gentle reassurances that I belonged there. Every morning, I woke up in a bed that felt too soft, too forgiving, as if it might swallow me whole. And every night, I fell asleep listening not to the cold silence of a parking lot, but to the distant hum of a house alive with warmth. He stocked the fridge with food I didn't have to ration, left books in the study for me to read, and reminded me again and again, "You are not a burden." At first, I didn't believe him. Years of being told I was nothing don't disappear in an instant, but slowly, like sunlight creeping through cracks in the blinds, his words began to warm the frozen parts of me, and I started to breathe a little easier. I remember the first dinner we shared at his dining table. The room was grand, with polished wood and golden lights spilling from the chandelier, but what struck me most wasn't the luxury, it was the quiet kindness with which he asked about my day, as though my small existence truly mattered. I stumbled over my words, not used to being asked, but he listened attentively, nodding, smiling at the little things. That night, as we ate together, I realized just how starved I had been, not just for food, but for care, for attention, for the simple dignity of being seen. And yet, beneath the comfort of this new life, a fear kept tugging at me, whispering that it was temporary, that the world I had escaped would find a way to claw me back. I thought about my stepmother's piercing eyes, about her cruel smirk, whenever she reminded me I had no one. I thought about my stepbrothers, their laughter echoing like a scar I couldn't erase. Even in the safety of my uncle's mansion, their shadows lingered. But my uncle noticed more than I realized. One evening, he found me sitting alone in the study, staring at the fire without really seeing it, lost in the storm of memories. He sat down across from me, his voice calm but carrying a weight of certainty. "You still think they have power over you, don't you?" I didn't answer, but my silence was enough. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "They don't. Not anymore. And if they try to touch you, they'll have to answer to me." Something about the way he said it, the quiet authority in his tone, made me believe him. This wasn't just an uncle offering shelter. This was a man ready to protect me, to fight for me in a way no one had before. That realization brought tears to my eyes again, but this time, they weren't born of despair, they were born of relief. He began to ask questions then, carefully and gently, about everything I had endured, not because he wanted to dwell on the pain, but because he wanted to understand the full truth. It hurt to speak it aloud, but it was different, now different, because I wasn't speaking into an empty void. I was speaking to someone who cared, who was angry on my behalf, who saw me not as a broken thing but as someone worth saving. Each time I told him a detail, his jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and I knew he was already planning what to do next. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," he said finally, his voice steady but burning with a quiet fire. "It's time they face the consequences." I felt a shiver of fear at the thought of confronting them, but also something else, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Strength, the idea that I might not have to cower anymore, that I might actually be able to stand tall with someone at my side, was almost too much to believe. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that my life was no longer defined by escape alone. I wasn't just running anymore, I was being given the chance to rebuild. And as terrifying as that was, it was also liberating. I thought of my father again, of the way he used to tell me I was stronger than I knew, and for the first time, I believed he might have been right. Because now, with my uncle standing beside me, I wasn't just a girl living in her car, hiding from the world. I was someone who could rise, someone who could fight. Someone who could finally take back the power that had been stolen from me. The day of reckoning came faster than I thought it would. My uncle wasn't the kind of man to sit back once he knew the truth. He carried himself with a quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be shouted to be respected. And when he told me that he was going to confront my stepfamily, I knew he wasn't making an idle threat. He meant it. I was terrified, of course, because the thought of standing face to face with the very people who had broken me felt like reopening wounds I had barely begun to heal. I had spent so long trying to escape them, building my entire survival on the idea of never having to see them again, and now the idea of returning, even with him by my side, made my stomach twist. But my uncle looked at me with a steadiness that anchored me, and he reminded me gently, "You're not going back alone. You're not the girl they controlled anymore. You're stronger now, and so am I." His words sat inside me like a flame, small but fierce, and for the first time, I considered what it would feel like not to bow my head when I saw them but to meet their eyes without flinching. When the day arrived, he drove us to the house I had once called home, though the word home felt like poison on my tongue when applied to that place. The neighborhood looked the same, but as we pulled into the driveway, memories rushed back like a flood nights of crying into my pillow. Days of being ordered around like a servant, voices cutting me down until I felt like dust. My chest tightened, and I gripped the edge of the seat, whispering, "I don't know if I can do this." My uncle glanced at me, his jaw set, and he placed his hand over mine, steady and firm. "You don't have to," he said, "but if you choose to, know that I'll be right beside you." Somehow, that gave me the strength to open the door and step onto the cracked pavement of that driveway. My knees trembling but my heart pounding with something new, defiance. The door swung open before we even knocked, and there she was, my stepmother. With her sharp eyes and tighter-than-iron expression, the same face that had haunted me in nightmares. Her surprise at seeing me was evident, but it was the sight of my uncle that made her falter. She recovered quickly, plastering on a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she said, "Well, isn't this a surprise?" My uncle didn't return her smile. His voice was calm but edged with steel when he replied, "Yes, it is. And it's time we had a serious conversation." Behind her, my stepbrothers appeared, their usual arrogance fading into something uneasy as they saw the power standing next to me. For once, I wasn't the smallest, weakest person in the room. I wasn't alone. What followed was a confrontation I could have never imagined. My uncle laid everything bare, his words sharp and unflinching, as he revealed what he knew, that I had been mistreated, cast aside, left to fend for myself in conditions no child should endure. My stepmother tried to deny it at first, laughing it off as exaggeration, but my uncle's eyes cut through her lies like knives. "Don't play games with me," he warned, his tone low and dangerous. "I know what you did, and I won't allow it to continue." The silence that followed was thick, and for the first time in years, I saw my stepmother shrink back, her confidence cracking under the weight of his authority. My stepbrothers shuffled uncomfortably, their smirks gone, their eyes darting anywhere but at me. As I stood there, watching it unfold, something shifted inside me. The fear that had chained me for so long loosened, replaced by something stronger vindication. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't weak. I was standing in the same house where I had once been broken, but now I was no longer a victim. My uncle's presence was like a shield, but my own voice rose too, trembling but firm. As I finally said the words I had carried inside me for so long, "You don't get to control me anymore. You don't get to decide who I am or where I belong. I'm done with your cruelty." The silence after my words was deafening, and though my stepmother glared at me with venom in her eyes, I no longer cared. I had spoken, and in speaking, I had taken back something they could never steal again, my voice. Walking out of that house felt like walking out of a cage, but this time, I wasn't running. I was leaving on my own terms, with my head held high and my uncle beside me. As we got back into his car, the air felt lighter, the weight on my chest easing for the first time in years. My uncle didn't say much on the ride back, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough, a reminder that I was no longer fighting alone. And though I knew healing would take time, I also knew that I had finally closed the chapter that had chained me to pain. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine, and for the first time, that thought filled me not with fear but with hope. The weeks after the confrontation became a time of slow rebuilding, like learning to walk again after years of crawling in the dark. At first, I felt disoriented, almost hollow, as though the absence of my stepfamily's cruelty left a strange silence inside me. For so long, their voices had dictated the rhythm of my life, what I was allowed to feel, what I was allowed to hope for, how small I had to make myself just to survive. Without that constant weight pressing on me, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. But my uncle never rushed me. He gave me the space to explore myself, to discover that I wasn't just the girl who lived in her car, or the victim of abuse, but someone capable of more than I had ever believed. He encouraged me to rest, to eat without guilt, to laugh without fear of punishment. Some days, I struggled to accept it, catching myself waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for kindness to vanish and cruelty to return, but it never did. Each morning, I woke up in that room that now felt less like a stranger's and more like my own, sunlight spilling through the curtains, and I realized that slowly, piece by piece, I was becoming whole again. My uncle became not just a guardian but a mentor. He shared stories of his own struggles, of the battles he had fought to build the life he had, reminding me that resilience wasn't born from comfort but from hardship. "You've already survived the worst," he told me one evening, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights. "So imagine what you can achieve now that you're free." His faith in me was something I wasn't used to, but it planted seeds of ambition I hadn't dared to nurture before. For the first time, I began to think about my future not as something to dread but as something to build. I enrolled in night classes, started writing again in the notebooks I had carried from my car. And with his support, I found myself dreaming of a life that wasn't defined by fear. Healing wasn't linear. There were nights when memories clawed their way back, when I woke up sweating from nightmares of my stepmother's voice, when I doubted my worth and wondered if I truly deserved the love being offered to me. But each time, my uncle was there, not to erase the pain but to remind me I wasn't facing it alone. He told me over and over, "Your past doesn't define you. What defines you is the strength it took to survive it." Slowly, I started to believe him. I began to see myself not as the broken child of a cruel household, but as someone who had endured, someone who had fought, someone who had risen. One afternoon, months later, I returned to the parking lot where my old car had been. It was gone now, probably sold for scrap, but standing there, I realized I wasn't sad. That car had been my prison, my shelter, my symbol of both despair and survival, but it wasn't who I was anymore. I stood in the empty space, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself, "I made it." And for the first time, I felt those words were true. Life with my uncle wasn't about wealth or luxury, though his mansion still amazed me sometimes. It was about the sense of belonging, the knowledge that I was no longer invisible. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. And when I thought back to the girl who cried herself to sleep in the backseat of a car, I wanted to reach out and tell her what I now knew, that storms do end, that kindness does find you, and that sometimes family isn't the one you're born into but the one that chooses to stand by you when the world falls apart. So if there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's this: no matter how deep the shadows, there is always a chance for light to break through. And sometimes that light comes from the most unexpected place: knock on a car window in the middle of the night, a voice calling your name with warmth, an uncle who refuses to let you fall. My story began with pain, but it doesn't end there. It ends with hope, with strength, and with the unshakable truth that I am no longer defined by what I escaped, but by what I have become.